long walk along the river, and it's quiet, it's peaceful, and it's absolutely beautiful. And there were actually a few tables set up there. And for those of you who have been following kind of my writing journey, I'm working on my second book, Decolonizing Faith. And this past month, I've gotten into a great writing pattern where I walk onto a library not too far from my house, and it's on a campus near our home. And I walk there, and I've been sitting on this patio overlooking the campus and doing some writing. And it's been a great way for me to do 30 minutes or so of writing every day on a consistent basis. And I've been getting a lot of work done. And this week they closed the campus. So classes started on campus, and they closed the campus to public access. And I can't get in there anymore. I learned, much to my dismay, on Monday morning that I couldn't get in there. And so I was looking for another place because I didn't want to ruin my pattern of writing every day. And so there is another park not too far from my house. DC has a lot of great public parks, and there's another park about a mile away from my house. Or half mile away from my house, I was able to walk to, and there's a bench there, but it wasn't quite as quiet, and it wasn't near as kind of away from the rush of everything. And it worked, but it wasn't perfect. And so yesterday, when my daughter and I were out walking, and the drive to the Arboretum is only is probably a 5-minute drive from our house. And then the walk down to the river is about maybe not even a 10-minute walk, a 5-minute walk. It's not even half a mile to get there going down this hill. And it's completely empty. And so this morning, after I dropped my daughters off at work, I walked down to the Anacostia River, and I found one of those benches and those tables set up. And this is the picture I took, right? This is where I was this morning. And then this is the picture of me set up to do some writing. And it was amazing. Absolutely amazing. I hope I can get there every day to do my writing. It's completely still, completely quiet, away from traffic, away from crowds or rushes of people. If I'm going there early in the morning, there's usually not even anyone down there yet. And it was a great place to do some writing. So I'm very happy again. I'm very happy to be able to get back to my pattern of both walking every morning, as well as writing, as well as getting out into nature and enjoying the beauty of the world around me. And so, yes, I'm very excited to begin to do go to this new location. I see Sunny. Hey, Yate, Sunny. It's great to hear from you the other day. So glad you're on this morning. Donna, Yate, Bennett, thanks for joining. Mr. Phil Fox, Shantina, Yate, thank you everyone for joining me. Grab your cup of coffee. I want to go back and discuss the debate of the GOP primary that ran last Wednesday, and I want to have a conversation about that. So I'm going to share an article with you that I didn't get to share last time, and let me put this into the chat right now. This is just an article on PBS News Hour, and it's who are the candidates in the first GOP primary debate. And it just gives you a short little breakdown of each of the candidates. Again, going in order of ranking from the polls, from the top down to the bottom. Ron DeSantis, Vivek Ramaswamy, Mike Pence, Nikki Haley, Christie, Tim Scott, Asa Hutchinson, and Doug Burgum were the 8 candidates who were on the debate stage. And if you listen to the coffee I had last Tuesday, you know that I discussed the debate and some of the conversation that they had, both regarding violence in our cities, regarding global warming, regarding abortion. And it was really striking, right? I'll summarize very quickly. When they were asked a question by a young person via video about how were they going to protect his generation from global warming, not a single candidate answered it, right? They literally just started screaming at each other and went into denial about global warming. And it was actually kind of comical to watch. If you go back and watch the debate, you can actually, it was comical to watch how they Yeah, they completely lost it when they were asked about global warming. They tried to have a discussion on abortion, but again, the thrust of the Republican Party is way out of sync with mainstream America and even with the demographics of their own party. And so Nikki Haley, who made the most sense of any candidate on stage, was shut down. Also, the only woman on the stage was shut down by all the men who were thumping their chests and quoting scriptures about their stances on abortion. And that discussion didn't go very far. And then they had their discussion on violence and the rise of violence in our cities, especially our urban centers. And they talked about the need for law and order, and we had to quit defunding the police and start putting more money into law enforcement. And then they were asked about President Trump and his court cases and his legal problems. And they pretty much all said, our legal system, our justice system has become weaponized and is being used for political purposes by the Biden administration, which was comical because earlier when they were talking about violence, it was not that this thing was weaponized. It's we need more law and order. Again, most of that law and order taking place on the streets of our nation is what's incarcerating people of color. But when a white landowning male from the 1% gets held accountable by our criminal justice system, now it's a weaponized criminal justice system. And the irony of that entire discussion, right, is if you ask any person of color, absolutely our criminal justice system is weaponized. Like that is absolutely true. But the only reason they're talking about it being weaponized is because it's trying to hold a white landowning male accountable. They were not able to have that discussion when it was about the violence in our cities, especially our inner cities and our urban centers, when most of the incarceration was taking place against people of color. Then we need more of that kind of law and order. But the law and order that holds white politicians and white landowning men accountable, yeah, no, that's weaponized. That's not what our criminal justice is used for. And they're not wrong, right? Again, I've said this before. You read our Constitution. The purpose of the Constitution is to protect the white landowning male. And so it was a very interesting conversation to see them have that. And this is where I ended my discussion on Tuesday, because I basically said what really struck me was how much the dynamics of a traumatized white America was completely at play within that debate. Now, if you remember back in my 2020 campaign when I ran for president, one of the things I said before that campaign and during the campaign is that if you want to be president of our country, right, you have to make yourself palatable to white landowning men, right? For nearly the past several decades, right, presidential politics have gone through two states. They've gone through Iowa, which is like the fifth whitest state in the country and has the highest rate of private lands of any state in our nation. And you have to go through New Hampshire, which is about the third whitest state in our country and has the highest rate of home ownership. And retail politics is what happens in both Iowa and New Hampshire, right? Every candidate spends months and months in both those states. They get to know everybody. By the time the campaign, the primaries are over, the citizens of those states are sick of the candidates. They've met them all. They've heard them all. They just want them out of their state. But that's how our primaries work, is you have to make yourself palatable. You have to make yourself appealing to white landowning men. They're the gatekeepers of presidential politics. And right, so this is where you have to learn to talk the language of American exceptionalism. I've talked about President Obama before, right? His entire key to his campaign, he said this over and over in his book, is that he was adamant they had to win Iowa. And they spent tons of money, and this is back in 2012, and they spent a lot of money and a lot of time because they knew if they wanted to have a shot at the presidency, President Obama had to win Iowa. So his campaign spent a lot of time and a lot of money there. And he said over and over throughout his campaign and in his book that he was not going to be the black president, right? He was going to stay out of that. And that's what you have to do, right? If you want to get the vote, the support and the money of white landowning men, you have to, that demographic sees Black people as a threat. Absolutely. And so you have to make yourself palatable. You have to show you're not a threat. You're not going to bring up these uncomfortable conversations. You're not going to have these uncomfortable discussions. You're not going to bring these things to the forefront. You're going to stay away from those things. And you have to learn how to speak the language of American exceptionalism. So that is presidential politics in a nutshell, is white landowning men are the gatekeepers. Now, it's fascinating because this year, right, the Democrats are going to go through South Carolina first, and which has a much larger Black population. And Joe Biden is talking all about how, yes, he's going to campaign there first. The hilarious thing about that is the only choice they're giving all these Black people in South Carolina to vote for in the primary is a white landowning man from the 1%. Right? They're not letting anyone else. He's the only one running in the Democratic Party. So it's like, okay, Black people, you can vote first, but you only get to vote for a Black person or for a white person, right? This is why the Democrats are terrified about Cornel West running, right? Because he's a Black person. And he actually has some very liberal Democratic policies in his wheelhouse. And so they're terrified of him because he might actually steal the votes of their white candidate. So anyway, this is presidential politics. And I talked about that. I was aware of that when I ran in 2020, right? This is why when I started my campaign, I announced my campaign in May of 2019. And I didn't go first to Iowa. I didn't go first to New Hampshire. That was an intentional decision of mine. I was strongly convinced that if you want to be president of this nation, the most appropriate and respectful place to go to your first campaign stops was to go to the native nations of this country. And so I visited in 2019 as many reservations as I could, going to reservations, campaigning to the people, bringing my campaign to the indigenous inhabitants of Turtle Islands first, allowing them to help shape my campaign and shape my policies. I still am deeply convinced that if you want to be president of the country, this is where you have to start your campaign. And I was adamant I was not going to let white landowning men be the gatekeeper for my campaign. I was going to allow the Native community to have a much greater voice and say in if my campaign moved forward or not. And so I was aware of all of that. But what struck me as I watched this debate last week, and I didn't watch it live, I watched it over the course of the weekend because it's kind of hard to stomach. But I think what really struck me as I watched the debate was how not only were the candidates living in a state of denial, right? And denial is the first symptom of trauma. But the most effective candidates knew how to effectively trigger and then soothe the fears of their traumatized audiences. They knew how to do that very, very, very well. Now, for those of you who don't know what I mean when I talk about the trauma of white America, let me give you just a brief overview here, so you understand this, right? So when we talk about trauma, the first thing that most people think about is PTSD. PTSD, it's a condition that affects you mentally, physically, emotionally, relationally. It's kind of this all-encompassing condition. But it comes from being victimized by a single horrifying event. It's a single diagnosis, an individual diagnosis for someone who's experienced a single horrifying event. And you can get post-traumatic stress or even a post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what most people think of when they think of trauma. Now, there's another type of trauma called a complex PTSD. A complex PTSD is an individual diagnosis still, but it doesn't come from a single event. It comes from a series of events. So if you can get PTSD from being assaulted, you can get complex PTSD from living in an abusive relationship. If you can get PTSD from being being in a battle. You can get complex PTSD from living in a war zone. And psychologists have observed that the symptoms of a complex PTSD are passed down generationally. They can observe the symptoms in the children and grandchildren of the people who experience the complex PTSD. They don't quite know how it gets there, but they have observed it. Now, there's a third trauma called HTR, historical trauma. This is not an individual diagnosis. This is how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. They observed it first in Native communities after removal and residential schools and massacres. They also observed it in African American communities after Jim Crow and segregation and enslavement. They've seen it in Jewish communities after the Holocaust, in Asian American or Japanese American communities after the internment camps. Right? So this is how psychologists understand the dissatisfaction in a broad community. I refer to historical trauma, just for sake of clarity, as a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex PTSD, if that makes sense. Now, understanding those traumas is really helpful, right? If you want to have a conversation about race in our nation, especially with people of color, because most people of color either have PTSD, complex PTSD, or historical trauma based on the history they've lived, and some even have all three. And so by understanding the trauma of audiences and people of color, you can actually have be more effective at engaging the dialogue you're trying to engage. But we all know the most disruptive demographic in any conversation about race is not people of color, it's white people. And for a long time, I observed what I labeled as trauma in my white audiences as I went out and spoke about the history of the doctrine of discovery, but I didn't have a way to categorize it. It wasn't PTSD, but I knew I was observing symptoms of shock and denial, and even the triggering, right, and the adrenaline rush and the loss of clarity that comes when you are triggered, right? And I was observing that in my white audiences, but I didn't know how to categorize it until I came across this book by Rachel McNair called Perpetration-Induced Traumatic Stress, PITS, right? She was doing some research on what she calls the psychology of killing. If society gives you the right to take a life, what does that do to you psychologically? That was the question she wanted to know. If you're in law enforcement, if you're a soldier, if you're a drone pilot, if you're in certain parts of the medical field, even if you're just a good white guy at the mall with a gun, right? And society gives you the right to take a life. What, she wanted to know, does that do to you psychologically? And she found it creates a trauma very similar to a PTSD. In fact, it has all the symptoms of a PTSD, but instead of afflicting the victim of the horrifying event, PITS afflicts the perpetrator, the person who caused it. Once I found her research, I was able to hypothesize that if PTSD has a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level that we call historical trauma that afflicts our communities of color, I would hypothesize that PITS might also have a multi-generational communal manifestation at a complex level, and that is the trauma I've observed in my white audiences. Now, white people are not victims of trauma. This is a perpetration-induced traumatic stress, but they still experience trauma, the shock and denial, the triggering, all the things that go on with a regular PTSD. They experience that as the perpetrators, as the people who are standing on that history, not who received it. And so this, for me, helps explain a lot of the reaction of white people, right? So when we have places like Texas and Oklahoma that can't even bring themselves to label enslavement as slavery in their textbooks, right? This is maybe not first and foremost racism. This might be trauma, right? They're so terrified, horrified by what they've done, what they're standing on. They can't even label it anymore. right? If you want to get white people screaming at each other, walk into a room of people from both parties and talk about immigration, right? You will get them screaming at each other. Same thing with gun control, right? You want to get white people screaming, just walk into a mixed political room and bring up the issue of gun control. They will begin to, you can see the trauma. They don't know how to have a conversation about these things. And what I was observing when I watched this debate is how effective some of the candidates were at triggering their white audiences just enough so their policies could soothe them and they could win the applause, right? So they would say something just enough to trigger their audience. So they would feel anxiety. They would feel like something was going to be exposed. There was this fear, this sense of almost like the adrenaline was beginning to flow. And then they would soothe that. They would cut it off very quickly with affirming the myth of American exceptionalism, or with doing something else to put their minds at ease with their policies. And they did this over and over and over and over again. This is why watching these debates is so absolutely tiring, because you're being brought through an emotional roller coaster where your adrenaline is going up and down, and you don't even know what to do by the time you get to the end of it. Right? The biggest difference between the trauma of people of color and the trauma of white America is white America is still in a state of shock and denial. Most people of color, at least we know we're traumatized, right? We know what's gone on. We know what's going on for us. White people are still living in the state of shock and denial. They don't even know what's happening to them. And what's fascinating is most of these candidates don't even know what they're doing. They're not even aware that they're dealing with trauma. They just note the reactions that they get when they say certain things. And this is why when something gets brought up, right, about the effects of the long-term effects of our colonial capitalistic nature, which has been destroying our environment for hundreds of years, and when we talk about what the consequence that might have on our long-term sustainability in this world, they have no clue what to say. Like, they start screaming at each other and even flat out denying it's even taking place. Right? It was very clear in the discussion on gun violence when they're talking about, yes, in our urban centers, in our inner cities, we have to reestablish the rule of law. We need law and order in our nation, in our cities. We need to have a strong police presence. We need to well fund our police and equip them and give them the tools and the policies they need to keep control there. Right? They were all pretty much on the same page as that. But then the moment you talk about, but what about this white landing owning male from the 1% who's now being held accountable by this criminal justice system, they flipped like that and they said, no, our criminal justice system is weaponized. Right? Again, this is the same problem the founding fathers had, right? They wanted a constitution. They wanted to live in a nation where all men were created equal, men, not women, right? And then they defined men as white men, landowning men, not the merciless Indian savages, right? They created a constitution, including we the people, never mention women, specifically exclude natives, counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. They're creating a place and writing a constitution to protect themselves. That's what they're doing. For all the rest of us, women, people of color, those on the margins, yeah, the Constitution is absolutely a weapon. It was not written to help us. It was written to keep us in control. And so when the Constitution starts being used to hold a white landowning male accountable, they freak out. They don't know what to do. Right? Now, again, I'm not picking on Republicans only. The Democrats do this just as effectively and just as blatantly. They have the exact same problems the Republicans have. It's just this wasn't their debate. So I'm using these Republican examples right now. But the Democrats do the exact same thing. Don't think you're off the hook just because you lean to the left. And so what it made me realize that if we really want to have political discourse, to have a real debate, because what we saw in that GOP debate, what we saw in the debates back in 2020 were not debates, right? They were ways to trigger and soothe a traumatized audience, to get sound bites and applause, and use that to determine who won or lost. This was not an exchange of ideas and a vision for this country. This was about how do we maintain the myth of American exceptionalism and get traumatized white people to vote for us and even to fund us. That's what these debates are about. And how do we sell marketing? How do we sell advertisements in the midst of it? This is why there's such big business for the news sources. And so what I realize is we need to label that early on, right? If I were on that stage, because I was watching this debate, right? And you get a minute to respond if you ask a question. You get 30 minutes to respond if you're mentioning someone else's answer. You're given opportunity for sound bites. And so I thought, okay, over the course of the hour, maybe you have 3 minutes, maybe you have 5 minutes, maybe even 10 minutes to say something. What would I want to say during the length of that time? And I thought I would want to identify, define the perpetration-induced traumatic stress and the trauma of white America. And then I would like to point that out in both the audience and in the other candidates. Because once you name it, once you label it, you see it, right? This isn't this. Once you point it out, you see it. And so once we can point out, yeah, DeSantis is saying this, or Vivek Ramaswamy is saying this to trigger people and then to soothe them, and then they're working to get a traumatized reaction and to get the applause. That's all they're going for right here. Once you point that out, then maybe you might have a better chance of having an actual discussion instead of just this emotional turmoil that happened during our presidential debates. But of course, no one is going to bring this up, right? I mean, this is why I ran back in 2020, because no one's going to talk about these things. But in 2020, I didn't work as intentionally to educate the public on the trauma of white America. And I think we need to do that. I think we need to do a better job of pointing out what is happening as it's happening, which will kind of disarm that whole interaction and possibly even leave space to have a real and maybe honest discussion. And I think that's what, in the end, we would all like, right? I would love to have an honest discussion without triggering everyone and screaming at each other and just demonizing one person and everything else. I'd love to have a real honest debate of what do you think your vision is for this nation? How do you want to move that forward? So I'm going to have more thoughts about this as we go through this political season, as I observe this campaign from the sidelines. I'm not running, but I definitely am going to have some thoughts throughout the entire campaign, up through the election in 2024. And I will share this with you as best I can during these times, during these cups of coffee. Let me just check the comments and see where people are at here. Appreciate everyone for jumping on here and making some comments throughout. It's good to see you here. Fidel Yat A, Dreaming Nirvana Yat A, thanks for being here. Oscar Yat A, thanks for being here. I hope that everyone's able to enjoy this. I hope this is enlightening and that you're able to kind of take some of this and use it to help filter through and even understand what's going on in our, especially this is most clear in our presidential politics. It happens in all politics, but it's most clear in our presidential politics because, right, we can wrestle with the fact that we have problems locally. We can wrestle with the problems that we have flaws at a individual or a local level. But when it comes to the whole of America, the only way we can see ourselves is as exceptional because it's the things we've done nationally, right, that are so horrific. And so this is where, in the presidential political debate, this is where the myth of American exceptionalism is so necessary for people to try to maintain it. And it comes very, very clear during those campaigns. Anyway, I hope all of this is helpful, my relatives. I hope you're able to use this in upcoming debates that you watch and articles that you read. And I welcome you to give me comments and feedback in the comment section, or to message me. And I definitely look forward to bringing this conversation forward. I hope your coffee is as good as mine is. Have a great day, my relatives. Walk in beauty. And may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Shahat, thank you for joining me. Hakonet. We'll see you later.